it's hard to beat a classic. So this week I'm looking at the Oloroso Sherry Cask finish from the Whistler Irish Whiskey. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this is the Oloroso Sherry Cask finish from the Whistler. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, what do I mean when I say this is a classic kind of whiskey? Well, in Irish whiskies, the most common kind of combination you will see will be a bourbon cask aged and a sherry cask finished Irish whiskey. This gives you notes of caramel, butterscotch, and kind of a bit of spiciness from that bourbon, but then it also gives you fruity notes, kind of nice baking spice notes, and some nuttiness from the sherry. So it does give a nice amount of complexity to an Irish whiskey. Some of the best known Irish whiskey brands on the market, things like Redbreast and Greenspot, are bourbon cask aged and sherry cask finished. So that's why I mean this is a kind of a classic Irish whiskey combination, that bourbon and sherry. This here comes from the Whistler and it's part of their cask finish series. So they've got ones that were finished in Calvados apple brandy, they've got ones that were finished in Imperial Stout to give different kind of flavors to the whiskey, but this here is their classic bourbon aged sherry cask finished whiskey. Now it is coming from the Whistler, like I said, but it is sourced whiskey. So the company behind Whistler, the Boan Distillery, they've only just started producing their own whiskey. Now it's just turned 3 years old, so only now will they have whiskey that's old enough to be sold. They probably won't sell a lot of that for some time, so they're going to be releasing more of these sourced whiskeys. So this here has been sourced from a different distillery while they age up their own stock. Now it is a blended whiskey. It comes in at 65% grain and 35% malt. Now that's a fair amount of malt to go into a blend. I mean, some malts, some blended whiskies will only use like 20% malt or 25% malt. So 35% is a nice amount of malt to see in a blend, but it is still going to be a blended whiskey. It also comes in at 43% ABV, so it's not going to have a huge amount of heat behind it, but it should have a little bit more flavor than you might expect from a whiskey that comes in at like 40% ABV. And lastly, it is a non-age statement whiskey. Now they did say that it spent 9 months kind of marrying in those sherry barrels, so it's probably maybe at least 3 years, 9 months, maybe 4 years, maybe 5 years old, but it's not going to be very old, but might be around that 4-year-old, 5-year-old mark. So let's go in for the nose on the Whistler Oloroso Sherry Cask finish. Okay, it's very sweet up front. I mean, with 65% grain whiskey, it's going to be quite sweet, but also that sherry influence has had a huge kind of impact on the whiskey. Yeah, you got your caramel, you got a bit of apple, but there's also some like dried fruits in there, some dried raisins, figs, that kind of dried, stewed, dark fruits are coming through in the nose. It's quite like a buttery nose. Like, I'm not really getting a huge amount of malt on the nose. It's more of that kind of buttery, sweet grain whiskey note, but I am getting a lot of that sherry influence. So there's a bit of like kind of toasted walnuts, that kind of little bit of nuttiness, as well as all that fruitiness, as well as all those dried out berries. There's a little bit of citrus peel as well. Like orange peel is coming through definitely on the nose, and as I sit with it, there's a bit of vanilla, but that's definitely kind of underneath all those other kind of flavors coming through. Like that sherry influence is quite strong here, which is kind of what you'd expect because they're highlighting the fact that it is a sherry cask finished whiskey. So let's go in for the palate. Cheers. That is where the malt is. So on the nose, I wasn't really getting a huge amount of maltiness coming through, but on the palate, huge amount of malt influence. You got that kind of malt grain influence coming through, but then it's also kind of like honeyed. So there are apples and pears and things like that in there, but if you imagine that they've been dipped in some honey, so you got that, you know, sharp, sweet, fruity core wrapped around of this this honey. So it's got a quite kind of rich mouthfeel on the whiskey. There's also a little bit of kind of nuttiness coming through, a little bit of spiciness coming through as well. Quite sweet leading up front with that sherry influence. So I'm going to go in for another sip and see what else I can find. Cheers. Okay, second sip round, definitely getting more of that kind of orange peel I was getting up front. Definitely getting more of like the sugary sweetness from the grain, but combined with the malt, it's almost like it's almost like burnt brown sugar on the top of a creme brulee, where you got the sweetness, but also that bit of spiciness, that bit of kind of deeper note than you would expect from just kind of standard brown sugar. There is a little bit of a tingle. Now, as I said, it does come in at 43% ABV, but there is a little bit of a tingle, kind of, it would almost indicate that the whiskey is either going to be higher ABV or it's a little young, so maybe the grain component isn't very young on the whiskey, but a little bit of tingling there at the end. But it is a very kind of sweet, honeyed, but the palate is generally quite sweet, quite honeyed, and quite fruity. So I'm going to go in again for another sip, but we're going to focus on the finish. Cheers. Okay, on the finish, it is quite rounded. So I know I said on the palate, a little bit of like tingly heat at the end of the palate, but then that fades pretty quickly. You get this, like you get this honey up front with the palate. Then as that fades, you get a little bit of like the alcohol tingle, a little bit of that coming through, and then that fades and you get this kind of wood spice coming through. So I wasn't really getting a huge amount of oak on the nose, or not a huge amount of oak into the palate, but on the finish, as the other notes start to fade away, that's where I'm getting kind of the oak spice come through, a little bit of oak, some more of those toasted walnuts, those kind of deeper, more earthy flavors coming through. And as I'm breathing, I'm almost getting a little bit of lemon. Now I know I just said it's the deeper flavors that kind of linger on, but as I'm breathing, I'm getting a little bit of that citrus coming back, but it's a little bit lighter, a little bit sweeter, kind of almost more like a lemon than an orange that I was getting in the other, like in the nose and in the palate. So this is just a nice kind of classic Irish whiskey. I mean, it's good to see the influence of the sherry on the whiskey. I mean, some Irish whiskies you see on the market, they have a little bit of sherry influence on it, just a little bit of a hint. This here, it leads with the sherry, and that's evidence of a good kind of cask program at the distillery. Now, when Rose and myself visited the distillery, which you can check out, I'll put a link up there and I'll link in the description below, we actually visited the Boan distillery and we got to see all their casks that they got maturing that are definitely going to pay dividends down the line, because I think this whiskey is evidence that they got some very nice casks that can deliver some very good flavor into the whiskey, and I think that's going to pay dividends down the line. I mean, if you're looking for a kind of a classic Irish whiskey profile, this is definitely one to try out, one to check out. If you've tried other Irish whiskies, you're going to be familiar with what's in this bottle, but it's going to be a nice representation of that kind of classic Irish bourbon and sherry. So what's your favorite kind of classic Irish whiskey? Let me know down in the comments below, and while you're there, let me know what whiskey you'd like to see me review next, because I put out whiskey reviews on Wednesdays, I put out cocktail recipes on Fridays, and I'll be putting out a cocktail recipe featuring this whiskey this Friday. So if you want to see more, make sure you scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Sláinte.